So welcome. This is the first of our snippets for the spring semester 3410. So I'll be doing this every week, 4 snippets, kind of outlining the relevant material that would have occurred if we were in lecture. You'll have to do a quiz. Also give me one factoid or question from the material. And so what I wanted to start with for this week is a kind of brief primer on the situation of the colonies in terms of the British international system. So this is basically 17th century, then into 18th century. So this is one of the earlier maps from the period, and I like this in part because it just shows the relative distance of the colonies. So the British colonies are here. This is almost all Spanish control. The Caribbean is under joint, some islands are under British control, some under Spanish control. Haiti is under French control. French are in control of Canada, but the important thing for our purposes is in the 17th century, so up until say 1730, 1740, this is really at the fringe. Although it is a kind of battle of empires, it's at the fringe of the imperial world for the Spanish, for the British, for the French. Latin America is more important. Areas on the African coast are more important. India will become more important for the British. Southeast Asia is more important. So it's not as if this area is really getting lots of attention in terms of policymakers. So if you think of this in the current American context, it would be like the equivalent of the Secretary of Commerce or something. Whoever was in charge of this within the British government tended to be a very low-ranking figure who would move on quickly. And here's the political map of what will become the full British North America in the mid part of the 1600s. And you can see here in the middle in purple, this is Dutch control. So the Dutch initially have their feet in the process as well, and the Swedes actually for a brief period control what's now Delaware. So for the British standpoint, it's like we don't really care about this very much. We're not going to devote a lot of thought to it. And the result is two contradictory policies, which begin to take shape constitutionally, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The first element of these policies, and really the most important of the sort of constitutional-like pieces of legislation during the British colonial period, is this law called the Navigation Act of 1660, which sets the terms for the British colonial system, including North America, and is a good example of a doctrine called mercantilism. So the basic idea of mercantilism is that colonies exist solely for the economic, strategic, political benefit of the mother country. And one of the principles behind the Navigation Act is that under the law, British North American colonies are supposed to trade entirely with Britain. So you're not supposed to have a kind of intercolonial trade. Material from Massachusetts is not supposed to be able to go to France or to Britain or France or Spain or British or even British colonies in the Caribbean or Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. So the idea is that you create a system where the material from the colonies just goes back to the mother country, and it's kind of an exploitative relationship. So in the idea behind the Navigation Act is that these colonies have no independence at all. The problem from the British standpoint is that the Navigation Act for roughly 100 years will be unenforced, and the British allow a good deal of trade and kind of political independence from the colonies, which is compounded by a series of decisions by various British governments to kind of use the colonies as a dumping ground for dissidents from Britain. So the idea is, send 3,000 miles across the sea, and so you don't need to worry about these people causing problems at home. So William Penn was affiliated with the Quaker sect, pacifist sect that is doesn't agree with military service, but is closely aligned with the close friend of the king, is given a charter. So that's basically a colonial constitution over what will become Pennsylvania, which is initially settled as a Quaker colony committed to the principles of pacifism. The Quakers will withdraw from Pennsylvania politics in the 1760s. Lord Baltimore, another figure who's sort of has good connections within the royal court, is given a royal charter for what will become the Maryland colony. Baltimore was the most prominent English Catholic in the late 17th century. Those of you who know British history, there have been a series of wars, including religious wars. The Catholics have been on the losing side. So the idea here is to allow Catholics to settle in Maryland, and if they're in Maryland, they can't be causing political problems back in Britain. And this man, James Oglethorpe, is given a colonial charter over what becomes the Georgia colony, a very, very fringe colony in the 18th century, which is designed for to be settled by ex-convicts, very similar to what happens with Australia. And this is a way for prison reformers to say, you don't need to worry about these exonerated prisoners being sent back into British society. They can be sent to Georgia. The problem from the British is that these are sort of two different kind of approaches. The Navigation Act assumes a very tight political economic integration between Britain and the colonies. The awarding of colonies to what we would now call political or religious dissidents implies that there'll be a kind of distance between the colonies and Britain. And what winds up happening in the late 17th and 18th centuries is that these colonies develop basically as kind of autonomous states, and nominally they accept the control of the crown, but really they don't, and they're operating a very, very dangerous neighborhood. So this is the political map of North America in the 1750s. The red areas are controlled by the British, the blue areas are controlled by the French, and the yellow areas are controlled by the Spanish. And what you should notice about this map is that there are a lot of striped lines. So the striped lines are the disputed areas in the map. This is a period, an area in which boundaries are not stable, and there's sort of considerable tension throughout the 1700s, which are compounded by the fact that this is a period. Again, those of you who know European history during this era have encountered this. This is a period of near constant war from 1689 until 1815 between Britain and France, who are the two superpowers of the era. So these North American colonies are kind of dragged into these conflicts, often in unusual ways. So for instance, in one of the wars, Queen Anne's War, the British colonists in New England basically stage a raid on a major French port, Louisburg, which controls the French maritime provinces. They're able to capture Louisburg, but then Louisburg is transferred back to the French as a result of a complicated peace deal. And so there's this sense that develops that the British colonies actually have different interests than the mother country, and that becomes clear in what is the decisive war in the pre-independence period, the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763, or the 7 Years' War in Europe from 1756 to 1763. And in the colonies, this conflict creates a degree of unity among the colonies, which the Navigation Act and Mercantilism would seem to imply can't exist. The originator of this movement is Benjamin Franklin. He proposes an alliance of the individual colonies along strategic grounds. He cites the effort from the previous war, and this is the fort of Louisburg that I was mentioning, that the British had returned Louisburg to the French. And the argument that Franklin makes is that really, if the colonists don't stick together, the British won't respect their interests down the road. And the result is this document called the Albany Plan of Union, which is never, sort of formally implemented, but is the first kind of quasi-constitution that's in existence in the British colonies. And the impetus behind Franklin is that the individual colonies should think of themselves as a unified group rather than as, Massachusetts or Virginia or Georgia, that they have more in common individually. And the Albany Plan of Union calls for powers that we would associate with a national government, that for security purposes, the colonies have the power to make laws and lay and levy such general duties, imposts, or taxes. Imposts are importation fees, as to them that shall appear most equal and just, considering the ability and other circumstances of the inhabitants of the several colonies. So the idea is that if you're in Massachusetts, you'll take into account the interests of people in South Carolina. But under the Navigation Act, these kinds of decisions are supposed to be made by the British alone. From the standpoint of the British colonists, the Franklin idea, it seems to make sense. And they see an increasingly unified colonial entity, although they're not challenging British authority in this period. In terms of what was then accepted political thought, however, Franklin's ideas were revolutionary. This is Montesquieu, the famous French political theorist. And Montesquieu's argument was that political authority had to be unitary, that there had to be one source of political authority. So it might be the king or it might be parliament, but you couldn't have what he referred to as a state within a state. So the idea of federalism, which of course is the governing principle now in the United States, federal government has some power, state governments have some power, local governments have some power. In Montesquieu's vision of politics, this is inconceivable. And the Montesquieu vision is essentially accepted by most European thinkers. Franklin is thinking outside of the box here. He's trying to come up with a way to ensure that the colonists will remain loyal to the crown, but nonetheless have their autonomy respected. But he's, the arguments that he's making are quite bold and in many ways revolutionary arguments, which, as we'll see, in the next snippet, increasingly fall on deaf ears in the UK. As it stands, the British win the war against the French. It's a more decisive war in the 7 Years' War, a more decisive victory than had been the case before. And the result is this new map. So the map on the left is the pre-war map. The map on the right is the post-war map. What should be most obvious here is that the French are kicked out of North America as a result of this 1763 victory. It might have seen an opportunity to reset the relationship between Britain and its colonists, but as we'll see, constitutionally, instead it triggers a crisis. So that's it for our first snippet. The second snippet will look at this post-war era.